Welcome to Alan Fulle's Art Interviews. I'm your host, Alan Fulle. I interview artists from the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Join me as we unlock the magic and mystery of these amazing artists. I'm interested in their process, technique, and tools these artists use to make their masterworks. Hi, Cameron.
Hey, Alan.
Thank you for coming over today.
Oh, my pleasure.
It was such a treat to see your beautiful house and studio.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it's an inspiring place to work and live. Yeah.
It's very nice. And your studio was so professional. I love how it's laid out and the tools. And I really appreciate you, showing us a little bit about your process. It was really valuable.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's so different than I think most artists. What I'm doing is really, I'm using so many different materials and techniques. And so the studio has to be a lot of different things. It has to be a wet studio for my dyes, and it has to be a dry studio for when I'm working on finished pieces. And then I have a whole sewing area. You can't mix those two together. So it works well. It's I used to have a bigger studios, but I've also had smaller studios. So you just make what you've got work. And I've managed to make work in every studio, so you just have to be flexible. But
So you brought us a couple of sculptures today. Do these have titles?
they do. They do. So this is part of a series that I'm doing that will have 9 to 10 sculptures in it for the show I'm going to have at Foster White Gallery in May this year, 2024. And these are all named after glaciers in Washington State. And the reason for that is the technique of dyeing that I'm using now that I really went deeply into during the pandemic is ice dyeing. And the ice dyeing is, I actually use ice as the melting ice to distribute the dye through the fabric. And that acts in a couple different ways, and we can go into that or we can talk about that later. But basically, the ice, it's through the melting of the ice that distributes the dye, and all dyes are made up of, if you're working with a pigment, say in a paint, it may be made up of mixed colors. You take a blue and a yellow and you mix them together and you get a green. In dye, those particles, those chemicals are separate chemicals that are in a mixture in a dry dye, but they're still separate. And the primaries mix when you add water or other chemicals. So when I'm using dry dyes on the ice distributes the chemical dyes through the fabric, but they might strike at different times. And so it both retards the reaction of the dyes, because instead of being a warm, cozy atmosphere for all the different colors to strike at around the same time in a mix, the different dye chemicals are striking on the fabric at different rates. So what it does is it sort of distributes the dye, breaks it down into its component parts, and mixes unequally, which gives it just a whole nother dimension of mark making. And what I've done for this body of work is I added gravity to the mix. So when I'm dyeing fabrics, they're literally hanging in the air with the ice and the dye on top of them. And as the dye melts, or as the ice melts, it carries the dye down. And so we get these kind of gradations and mixing of colors where they're separating, but they're almost in a watercolory wash, which I really can't get any other way. So, getting back to why these are named after glaciers, when I'm literally watching ice melt and that affect the dye, I just really can't help but think about climate change and how our glaciers, our local glaciers, are melting and disappearing and receding, how the sea ice is melting and how that's going to affect our coastlines. And so all of that political and environmental issues are really at the forefront of my mind. So this series, whenever I do a series of sculptures, I use a naming mechanism where they're all related. I did some work during the pandemic that were all named after neighborhoods in Seattle because we were all in our homes. I've done the last series I did were named after peaks in the Olympic Mountains that I can see from my house, as you saw earlier today. And so it's always something in the environment that I can have multiple pieces that have a related name. So I really do work in series. Each series has a kind of a through line. So this one is called Emmons from the Emmons Glacier, and this one is Nisqually. And so I, yeah, so those are both on Mount Rainier and both being studied actually, especially Nisqually, um, because of the receding of the glaciers. So I don't think they look like glaciers. I'm not trying to make things that look like receding glaciers, though some of the pieces are in blues and greens, and but some of them are red. So it's more about the concept. So
Now, how did you come across or come upon these types of tower forms? What was the original inspiration for the shape?
yeah, well, that's interesting. I've been working with this vertical tower form for pretty much my whole career in making sculpture out of these materials. It just appeals to me. There's something in me that recognizes that form. And when you work in abstract, it's like, how do you decide, right? It's more what you feel or you're drawn to. These I have made a little bit differently than what I've made before, as far as the actual design and construction. Um, Before I would always draw, I would start with drawing, and I would be looking at photos, say, of rock faces or, whatever kind of natural forms I'm looking at, a lot of rock faces. And I would draw from that, and then I would extrapolate into 3 dimensions from a 2 dimensional drawing into 3 dimensions. And I always start building my patterns in paper, kind of like a tag board. It's like file folder kind of paper. It has a certain sort of flexibility and stability that the underlayment of these pieces that I use, which is actually a sewing material, but it mimics it. So that's where I build in, and paper's cheap, and I can cut it and stick it back together and start over, and it's inexpensive material to get to my patterns. Um, but these pieces, I felt, and I feel like for the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, I've been just trying to get to a more of a place of immediacy with my work, trying to capture, say, brushstrokes, which is very difficult on fabric because it absorbs with dye. You can paint, but I all of my work is dyed. Although I do use some rust to stain the fabric as well. But I'm a little bit of a purist for some reason about wanting to stay with the dyes. So it's not like I can dye something and say, oh, that looks really good, except for that one spot. I'm just going to add a little white paint right there. Well, I don't do that. I don't change the appearance of the dyed fabric after. It's really all of the color, all of the everything you see is happening in the dye bath. And then I'm selecting and cropping and editing from that. So, um, where I was going, immediacy. So these I just worked in a different way, and I just took a piece of that tagboard and I would kind of just curve it around onto itself and tape the edge. And then I had this, column basically that was sort of teardrops shaped from the top, and I just started cutting and taping them back together. And so the process, and there was no drawing at all. And so the process was just really much more immediate for me and much more hands-on, and in some ways easier and in some ways harder. Um, and I had to kind of figure out how to do it. I'm not a person who just can make the same thing over and over again. I get bored. I have a short attention span. Life's too short, you know? And there's nothing against people who do that sort of meditative work that's almost Zen-like, of creating, tying the same knot over and over again. I respect that. It's just not me. Now, maybe some people would look at my work and say, "Oh, she's made another one of these," and maybe that's true. I'm sure I have a voice, just like you have a voice in your artwork that's recognizable. Um, but yeah, so I just, I took that piece of paper and kind of curved it around on itself, and then I just started. I'm like, well, what does that sideline look like? And I just kind of drew it and cut it and taped it back together, and then looked at it again, and I was like, well, what do I want to have here? Because each one is based on a triangle. Sometimes they have like a little extra gusset, but they basically, are triangular. It's the strongest shape, more stable shape, a triangle. So they all have three sides, although sometimes they have a little extra facet. And, so what does that middle cut, what does that look like? Where is it? And then I cut them and I tape them and I start over and I cut them and I tape them. And where I cut that, because it's curved, it makes a line. So it's just a kind of a manipulating materials, and that has been really fun for me. It kind of gets more in the childlike way of working, but also I guess maybe more back to like trying to find my joy. Like, where is the joy? Like, I just feel like we are all coming out of such a serious time, and things are still pretty serious. I'm not saying that, but like just being able to have some more fun, you know, and not have to have everything be so studied, because there's still plenty of that. But just, I don't know, immediacy, fun, joy. I was trying to. I went to see the Calder show at Sam, and I was like, oh, this just makes me so happy. Just that I just made me want to go dink around in the studio and make things on wire and just like get back to some of the original ways I entered into art, just wanting to find more sense of joy, more sense of play, and not so, um, having to be a serious artist all the time. You know, I don't know. Maybe as I get older, I'm maybe trying to get younger or something. I don't know. But that's kind of, yeah. So, long answer to that question. But yes, that's how I started with these things, and they are different. And whether people recognize that or not, I don't know.
So if we were to kind of pull out
Mm-hmm.
from your career, where does this body of work? So you're interested in fabrics, and you also do some public art pieces at Burning Man.
Mm-hmm.
And where does this fit into the constellation of your
Mm-hmm.
work?
That's a good question. I mean, it's squarely in the fine art gallery focused work. However, this same technique of this gravity ice dyeing is going to be the central part of a project that I'm going to be doing at Burning Man this year. So, and I also use this technique for a line of hand dyed accessories, as that's sort of my side hustle. And a project I do with my daughter. And because I do feel like there's just so much beauty in it that I'm like, oh, wow, I just want to look at this all the time, and I feel like in a way it sounds crazy, but it's much less labor intensive to create these fabrics because time is doing a lot of the work. I set it up and then it kind of drips overnight and I go back and check it and I mist it and make sure it's still wet and all that. But mostly it just kind of does its own thing as opposed to something like a batik where you're drawing out wax and then you're painting on dye and then you're going and doing another layer and then you're painting on dye and then these multi layered things, and then you have to wash out everything and process everything, and it's just it's just so much more time consuming that there's this pleasure in doing less and doing more in a way, recognizing that less can be more. And maybe that is, again, an age thing, a confidence thing where I don't have to feel like I have to prove myself all the time. But also I'm totally into these techniques right now, and I'm just like so excited about it. And yeah, I just enjoying this kind of immersion in this color and movement in a way that I feel like I haven't allowed myself to in the past so much. And when you work with fabric and dyes, there's always a comparison to tie dye, right? Oh, I've done tie dye. People are always like, "Oh, you work with fabric? Oh, I've tie dyed." Or my aunt, or I did that at camp. We did T-shirts, and that's great, awesome. Everybody should do tie dye. It's so much fun. Um, but what I do is elevated, shall we say? I mean, it's not just squirting color on a t-shirt. It's really, there's so much thought that goes into it and so much study of traditional techniques that I've done as far as techniques in India and techniques in Japan, and experimentation, hours and hours of experimentation and note taking, and you should see my notebooks. It's ridiculous. I have like notes on everything. And dye, what does this dye look like on cotton? What does it look like on silk? What does it look like on rayon? What does it look like with bleach? What does it look like with a different kind of bleaching agent? It's just like 25 years of experimentation in the studio with documentation. That's just the kind of nerd I am. um, and see, I keep just talking and forgetting what your question was. So
You're doing fine. So do you have so let's talk about influences. Other artists that you look to that provide inspiration, or what what are your source inspirations?
yeah. Well, Um, like I said, it was just such a joy to go to that Calder show. I remember how turned on I had been about making when first exposed to Calder, and that kind of um, perfect imperfection, not having to have every, I don't know. It's so immediate, it's so beautiful, it's so fun. Ruth Asawa, really just very inspiring, and her use of form. Also, as a mother of children, who was producing while she was also raising children. My kids are out of the house now, but for a lot of my art career, I was balancing between being a mom and being an artist. So that's a very real experience for mothers, to see her do it. And her work's so beautiful. Um, Andy Goldsworthy, just really, again, when I wasn't, I've done a little bit of everything. I came up in theater was my first love, dance, poetry, graphic design. That's what I was doing as a profession until I had my kids, and now, and then festival arts, making giant puppets and parade floats and things like that. Just really, a lot of it has been really around community. Um, And so Julie Taymor, the artist director who did The Lion King, who did spacing on a bunch of her other work, just she's an amazing, amazing theatrical artist. And she really inspired me when it came time to doing installations because she's thinking about not just this object, but how does this object work with the overall, what is the overall concept? How does every piece of that tie into telling a story? And I think that that is, I guess when I think about my work, it's really not just about one beautiful piece, but what is the story? And that's where I'm working in series. And each body of work, each time I have had a solo show, it has a different artist statement because each body of work is telling a different story. Is it about it's always about the environment, but is it about, like this show is really about climate change and melting ice, but I did a show called Fields that was really about looking at those interstices between cultivated land and natural land. Got inspired looking down from an airplane where you see the fields and then that field runs into the river and the river makes its own line, and really looking at those lines in nature and where we live and how the human hands on nature. I think all of my work is really about that. It's about nature and the touch of human hands on it and how we can be stewards of the world, because this is what we got. We melt it all, we burn it all up, it's not going to be left. And as a mother of children who are not children anymore, they're adults, what are we leaving them? I think it's such a serious time to be living. And so influences, I would say, Andy Goldsworthy, where he was really recontextualizing nature and giving in his photographs, by arranging stones and gradation of color, or creating ephemeral sculpture out of, ice things. What do you mean? The things that hang down. Ice, oh shoot.
Icicles?
Icicles, thank you. Or, just that kind of work, it just kind of blew my mind when I first saw it. It just got me thinking about art and nature and the world. Yeah, and then so many people working in fibers and dyeing. There's, teachers that I've had. Jane Donewald, she's amazing. She really created this, has written several books that are so well researched and clearly written that you can check it out of the library or buy the book and just go through it and you'll know so much more. I'm self-taught. Nobody taught me how to do dyeing. I took one class. I think I've taken maybe 3 classes, and otherwise it's all just work I've done on my own. But I've done the work on my own with the books from the authors that really, I learned how to do it by just going on the library's website and typing in search word, dye, and checking out every single book, and then pulling that out of the library and looking through it and seeing what I wanted to try, what I wanted to do, and and then did it fit or didn't it fit? Does it work for me or doesn't it work for me? But Jane's books, she came up with this idea of complex cloth, where she is layering techniques on the same piece of cloth. So maybe you dye it and then you bind it and you dye it again, and then you take a silk screen and you print on top of it, and then you foil on top of that, or you take color away. Just this idea of working and reworking cloth is really fascinating to me. And then adding stitch or patching it together, putting something over it, or turning it into a 3-dimensional object. She was an excellent teacher. I have taken a couple workshops with her as well, but her books, so many people like that. Yeah, yeah. So, and then the more performative pieces or installation pieces, the public art pieces, working at Burning Man is sometimes I consider myself, even though I work in two dimensions as well, I consider myself a sculptor. And I, even when I'm working in two dimensions, I'm working really hard to create a certain objectness to a two-dimensional object. And, if you're a painter and say you're painting nothing against painters, love painters, but, if you're a painter and you're painting a barn, then, you paint it dark in the back so that recedes, and you paint it lighter in the front, and you have the shadows and you have perspective, and, your eye tells you that's an image of a three-dimensional object. I don't really have that in what I'm doing because it's abstract, but I'm still working with value. I'm still working with composition, and I'm working with dimensionality, very thin, and with thread and with different kinds of fabrics. So, something like that's very matte will absorb the light, whereas something that's shiny will come forward, just like in any kind of art with painting. But I do feel like installation is the purest form of what I do. And um, and I think part of that goes back to my theater background. I was that lonely, nerdy kid who moved all the time growing up and never had friends, and it was just we were poor, single mom, blah blah blah. Um, And when I came into theater, it was like, oh, here's a community. This is just like, oh, it was so healing for me. And there's still this sense for me of when I do an installation, when I work at Burning Man, or really anywhere, it's a collaboration. Like, I can't do all of this stuff. I have to work with, I'm not going to build the structure. I don't work with wood. I don't have the tools. I don't electricity is just magic to me as far as I'm concerned. I have no idea how it works, other than turning the light off and on and, making sure it's plugged in. I'm just not, I can't know everything and I can't do everything, but I know amazing, wonderful people that I can work with. And I can talk to them and say, I wanted to do this, or how can we do that? Or, can you make it feel more like this? Or I want this little house that we can go in and you can sit there and feel comfortable. And, we want benches and we want this, and, um, and I know these amazing people who can do that. And, um, and so to me, that collaboration, when we make art at Burning Man, it's not under the name Cameron Ann Mason. It's under the name of our collective, which is Dusty Nation. And it's very dusty there, and the idea of it's a destination, um, and that we are a nation. We are builders and creators and makers who come together to make crazy, beautiful, or perplexing, interactive things. And that thing about installation is that it not only gives you three dimensions, but it gives you that fourth, which is time. So, and I think fifth, you could say interactivity, where you can enter into a space and it can change your perception, and you can turn and see a different view, and you can turn and see a different view this way. And each one of those, it's immersive in that way. And that's what gets me so excited about making work at Burning Man. Plus, it's just really, really fun and really crazy and intense. And this is will be my 15th year there. Apparently I still love it, and but I have no interest in just going to the party anymore. Like, I mean, it's great. It's like one of the greatest parties in the world. I'm not much of a partier, really. I'm not I always joke that I get the most sleep and do the least drugs of anyone at Burning Man. I like to go to sleep early, but I like to get up really early and ride around on the playa and take pictures, because it's so beautiful there. And there's just something in it that keeps me going back. And the best way to go is to bring art, because then you get to um, interact with people, and you get to communicate, and you get to create something that other people and that it's not a, it's the antithesis of a gallery. Nothing is for sale. You can touch everything. You can climb it. You can interact with it. You can sleep in it. You can make love in it. I mean, you can do anything, you know. But people are relatively respectful. There is some vandalism there that I think it's just the world. But in general, people are so respectful, and it's just a joy. So.
So, do you have a philosophical perspective that you could share with us?
Hmm.
What keeps you going? What is the
What keeps me going? That's a good question.
what?
I'm not a religious person. Um, I do believe that we're all, I don't know, connected in some way. I have to think that I don't know. I don't have to think. I like to think that there's more to the world than meets the eye. But I do believe in community. I do believe in the essential goodness of people, even in these dark times. I really do believe that you may not agree with some people in the world, but if you may have this person you would never ever think that you could connect with, and yet if you were hurt or they were hurt, you wouldn't think for a moment about what are your politics. You know, people help people, people lend a hand, and I do believe in that, really do. I believe I have to be creative. It's just part of myself. You know, if I'm not creative, I'm not myself, and I get depressed. I mean, if I can't be making, then yeah, I'm not me. So that's so important. Um, I believe in, I don't know. That's as far as and one overriding philosophy. I don't know. I love to make things. I love my friends. Um, I love travel. I like food. You know, the pleasures of life. You know.
So that's the meaning of life, is to enjoy it.
Is a good meal, a
Except,
conversation with good
well,
friends, interesting. I mean, you know, it could be a lot worse than that.
it sounds good.
I mean, I don't know. What is the meaning of life? Is that my responsibility to know, or to? I mean,
I'm just trying to figure it out and uncover that. One of these guests is going to impart, is going to just lay it down.
Like, oh,
I was like,
thank
yeah.
you. That's why I'm doing this. I've been waiting for someone to tell me the meaning of
just
life.
Keep digging, and at some point I'm going to find a big diamond.
How about I'll just give you some glints there? No, I don't know. What is it? What is the meaning of life? I think it's just do good work and be honest. I'm like, I don't really understand lying or not being true, you know? It just feeling feelings and being in it. No. Sorry, I don't have any diamonds for you.
So we talked about your influences. We talked about some of your perspective and the joy you have with community, and what you're focused on now. What about the future? How do these works, or the public art Burning Man pieces, or where do you see going?
Yeah.
Is this guy? Are you gonna?
That's an excellent question. My husband is looking at retiring, right? So, and he's a little older than I am, and I'm like, okay, that's great, but don't expect I'm going to entertain you, you know? I mean, that's not my job. I have a job. I'm an artist, right? Love you, but go have fun. No, it's interesting, especially given that he's looking at, we're going to want to travel more. I don't want him and I don't want me to die at my desk, right? Not too much else to do in the world. But it does bring up questions about how does that fit in with continuing to work. I don't have the same energy I did 20 years ago, you know? So what would it look like to slow down? What would it look like to do less? What would it look like? I had several years in a row where I had a solo show every 18 months at Foster White, and it was like, it was not fun. That was just too much. It was too much. I didn't have any downtime. I was always stressed. It was during the pandemic, so I was always stressed anyway, but and I wasn't doing anything but working, so it was kind of okay, but I realized, whoa, that's too much. So I know that I can't really do it more than every 2 years. And maybe that stretches out a little bit. Maybe there's more travel, maybe, but I don't actually know. I mean, the thing is that, I mean, I just hope for me, and I hope that everyone is just a lifelong learner. Like, I get excited by doing things in the studio and trying something new. And that's what gives me, the buzz to get up in the morning and go to the studio. I never get tired. I never get tired after 20, almost 25 years now of dyeing fabric. Every time I wash it out, it's like Christmas morning. It's like, what has the dye writ today? What is in there? Because oftentimes I'm dyeing things, right? And they're like in little packages with ice, and they're just like a big blob when I look the next day to go wash it out, and then I open it up, and it's like every day it's like Christmas. It's like, what is it? And that to me is just so that keeps me going. It's so exciting, and manipulating material, figuring out new ways to build things, to make things. I would like to do, I was, we were talking about social media, and, on Instagram, I follow all these different things. And some of the things I follow are like people making stuff with kids, or a lot of crafty things. And I think, oh, that looks fun. I want to just go like fold something up and cut it up and then open it out. Or I want to make this thing where I don't know, like, I take this yarn and I dip it in glue and I don't know. I want more play, I guess. And, I've had this, what a lot of people would feel like is a luxury of being able to be an artist as my job. So many people who are our age, my age, are looking at retirement, and that's now they get to start making their art or making their and I have had been able to do that and have that creativity in my daily life without having to um, stress about having working in the factory or whatever it was. um, and I do not take that for granted. So it's interesting then. It's like, well, I'm already doing the thing that people dream about doing when they're retired. So what am I going to do when I retire? And I don't know what that is yet. I'm excited. We're planning a trip to Japan this fall. So I'm very excited to go there and see a lot of these, traditional artisans and where it all began. Um, I don't know. I don't know. I'll find out something else to do and I'll do it, and I'll get all excited about it. And for now, I'm not ready to stop being a professional artist because I still want to make things, and what else would I do with them? But it would be nice to have to not make things with the idea of that they're going to be for sale. And that's the thing about Burning Man, or making that kind of work. That's not for sale. That's just for me. And so I get a lot of joy out of that, even though there's still a lot of deadlines and there's still a lot of stress, and it's a different kind of work, but it's not attached to a dollar, um, which is nice. It's really nice. And we're also, for this year, we got funded by the Burning Man organization to bring art. So not only um, I the other thing about it though is if you're making art for Burning Man, oftentimes you're having to do a ton of fundraising to be able, because it still costs materials to make that stuff. So this year, Burning Man is basically supplying us with the materials in the form of a check, and and so that's really great because it can really take a lot of that extra pressure of, we were talking about this. It's like you not only have to make the art, you have to promote the art, and you have to be on social media, and you have to price the art, and you have to, you know, photograph it, and you have to, it's just like there's just so much. There's just so much to. You got to do your taxes, and it's like all of the things that we have to do as well. It's not just one job, and anyway, I don't know what I'm doing. That's the answer to that. I don't know what's next. I don't have any big thing. More of the same, but different.
So you grew up in Seattle, did you? Or what is your origin
Yeah,
story?
that's a good question. I was born in Los Angeles. Um, my parents divorced when I was 2. My mom was, many would call her a free spirit. She, um, she was not a traditional person. She also, these days there'd be lots of good drugs for her to be on that I think would have made her life much more um, even. But she had mental health issues, and and she was unable to work. So we were very poor, and ended up moving to Hawaii till when I was 4, and lived in Hawaii till I was 10, and then moved from there back to the States and kind of lived in our car off and on for a period of time. I basically moved. I never went to one school for an entire year until I was in 6th grade when I told my mother I wanted to go to one school for a whole year, and she's like, "Oh, okay." We still moved, but then she drove me to the school. It's like it never occurred to her like maybe that would be a good thing. So my education is so was so interrupted. Um, and then we ended up kind of settling it down a little bit more in Oregon, but we were living sort of in rural Oregon, which wasn't a good fit with my free spirit hippie mom. So that was challenging. I eventually ended up in Portland and went to performing arts high school. And that is where, like, it was like my life changed, like from one day to the next, just to be around people who were creative and who were, it was incredible. I mean, I feel like the only way I survived all of that was just I have a certain amount of native intelligence, and able to I'm able to be social. I have good social skills. And so, um, but what the reality is, I ended up having to parent myself mostly. And so, that creates a certain kind of person. Perhaps that's why I'm so organized and controlled about everything. I have to, put that in wherever I can. But, you know, my I never took an art class. I never took art. Um, I was in theater, did dance, and then I went to college for a couple of years, but I had grants, but then Reagan came into office and cut them all off. And so then I ended up having to leave college, because I couldn't afford it. And so I actually never got my bachelor's degree. Um, I always figured I would go back when I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't see any point in going into debt to get a degree in poetry. That just didn't make any sense at all. So I decided at one point that I liked the idea of graphic design. I didn't even know what it was, really. I was like, this seems like a good thing. Like, I can be creative, but I can also be a business person. This seems like it would play into my strengths. And so I went to design school, never ever having taken an art class. And I went to the Art Institute of Seattle, which is no longer there. It was a 2-year program. It was definitely a, for-profit school model. I went through, I worked my ass off. I had also worked at a PR firm in their design department as kind of the gopher. And I got out and I got a job, as a designer. And that's what I did. And I paid off my school. And that's, besides taking a few art classes here and there from different people, um, that's how I got here, And so it's a very different, you know, trajectory. And I think it's just like that's kind of how I am. It's like nobody taught me how to make this, right? When I was a kid and we didn't have anything, I would make stuff out of paper, cardboard boxes. And I've always had a 3-dimensional mind. I was never the girl who played with Barbies. I always made Barbie's house, out of a cardboard box, out of a shoe box, out of paper. I would make these elaborate, I was really into working with paper, and I would make these little elaborate kind of dioramas and all that. And I would try to put them together and measure really carefully, but then I didn't know about adhesives. You make something with Elmer's glue because that's what you have, and it's all like this, and it didn't quite work. It doesn't get to, but that's where, and I'm still doing that. I'm still cutting up paper and taping it together. And I think that's always been there. That's in my brain. That's how I work. And luckily I can do that now and make it pretty, and then have people want it. So, and want to look at it. So that's like, I get the success story check mark, I feel like that has been, but it was a long journey to try to figure that out, So, yes, I'm not from Seattle, but I have lived here since 1981. So it's practically like being from Seattle. Lots of people have been born since 1981 who are from Seattle, so I think I count.
Not really.
No.
I was here since '64, so.
All right. So you're from here. Born and raised.
So, are there any secrets you need to unburden yourself with? Here is the forum for.
Well, secrets. Oh my God. I don't think so. Gosh, that was a trick question.
I don't know where that came from.
I don't know. Secrets? I don't know. What are my secrets? I don't have any secrets. I think, we've talked about this. Art's a business, right? Making is, well, I shouldn't say that. Art is making. Art itself is not a business, but selling art and trying to be a professional artist is a business. And I think that if you're not aware of that or not wanting to see that, then you're kind of fooling yourself. And not you yourself. I'm not talking about you, Alan. I'm just talking about people in general, Whether a gallery wants to take your work has nothing to do with the quality of the work. It has to do with, can they sell it? And that's just the truth, I know so many people who are amazing artists who don't have gallery representation, or and me, I think part of it is because I'm self-taught. I've never gotten a grant that wasn't for Burning Man or for a public art thing. Not once. I don't get prizes. I don't get picked for, XYZ show. And I think that part of it is I didn't come up in the system. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself so that I can feel better about myself. The secret is I'm just as neurotic and anxiety prone as everyone else. I'm always trying to, maybe it's from being that poor kid, always the new kid in the school. I'm always wanting to know, do you like me? Like, am I okay? Like, that's always there. But anyway, enough about that.
All right. Well, is there
Anything else?
anything else you want to? Yeah. How do you? So this magical interview that you've constructed and supplied, what? How do we draw it to a close? What is the? What if you cut to the chase?
Mm-hmm.
What are we trying? What are you trying to say here? What's your statement?
Well, okay. I mean, I can talk about my materials a little bit because I really feel like what I do is it's not a painting. It's not a stone sculpture. It's not something we necessarily have words for. It's like s- sculpture is made of soft materials, you know. And I feel like we talked about this a little bit in the studio that fabric is this thing that is just an intrinsic part of our lives. Like right now, we're wrapped up in fabric, right? Our clothes. Um, it's the first thing we touch other than the skin. You know, we're wrapped up as a baby. We are from our swaddling clothes to our shrouds, right? We're all almost always touching cloth in our lives. And it's sort of this magical thing in that it can be so many things, um, and to take that and transform that into fine art is in a sense transgressive, right? I mean, it's taking something out of its usableness. These are not useful objects. You can't put flowers in these, you can't carry water in them, you can't store grain in them. They're really just for looking at. And so to take that out of its usable context is it's just noteworthy, I think. It's a to me it's interesting, and I hope it is to other people too. I think people respond to the work. I hear them, like they don't know what it is. Is it ceramic? Is it glass? And then they get close. It's like, oh, that's sewing. Oh, it's fabric. And I think that to me is just exciting and keeps me coming back. Um, I don't know. I think that's as good a place to end as any.
Thank you so much for coming. It was such a pleasure, and
It really
it
is.
was so cool to visit with you today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share my secrets.
For paintings and sculptures, check out alanfulle.com.
Hi, I'm Cameron Ann Mason, and I'm really excited to be on Alan Fulle's art interviews. He's visiting me today in the studio to get a little close up of what I do, and I hope you can tune in. Hi, I'm Cameron Ann Mason, and welcome to my studio. I'm an artist working with fabric, hand-dyed fabrics, and my work is a combination of surface, form, and stitch. Each piece is made entirely with hand-dyed fabrics, And then I work in both 2 and 3 dimensions. And then I finish all of my pieces with sewing, and which integrates all of the pieces into, adds a finish to them, but also connects with what is traditionally women's work of sewing and making, and while also kind of elevating the work from a usable object into fine art. What else can I say? I also make 3-dimensional forms. I start working with paper and create the forms, and these become my patterns for the pattern pieces. And then I marry those with the fabrics, making choices depending on what I'm trying to say in the piece. And so this is a finished piece. And you can see the similarity of, there's a different pattern, but where it's starting with that paper and then translating into the fabrics. And I combine a lot of different techniques in my dyeing. I use a combination of, for this particular body of work I've been working on, I do a lot of ice dyeing, where the melting ice is actually what's carrying the color through the fabric. But I also use some, like this is maybe hard to see on this velvet, but there's a striation on that, and that is using a traditional Japanese technique of arashi shibori, where I'm compressing fabric around a tube and then putting the dye on, and where it is compressed, the dye can't reach as well, and so you get a variation in color in a very, it has a pretty specific look. I also do a lot of printing using botanicals, and I'm using a lot of ferns in this body of work. Really, the native sword fern and bracken ferns really give us a lot of information about native plants and where our environment is, and these plants that are really hardy and grow on the edges between natural areas and more lived habitat. And I use a lot of different fabrics in my work. I use, really gives a different textural use. So this is a cotton fabric, where this is a velvet. I use also, and this is a silk. So this is a silk crepe. You can see it has maybe a really matte surface that kind of absorbs light, whereas the velvet both absorbs and reflects. And it has just a different feel than the cotton. So I'm using these fabrics as well to add to the textural quality and depth of the pieces. Each fabric absorbs and reflects light in a different way. Each fabric takes the dye in a different way, depending on its fiber content and its weave, just a lot of different elements. In this piece here, which I'm working on, I have this here is a botanical print with the sword ferns, and this is actually a linen that I took from that I got at a garage sale of antique table linens. So I like to sometimes incorporate those because they talk about the home, and they've been used. They've been on the Thanksgiving table when the family gathered over years. They've been as pedestrian as soaking up a spill or wiping a mouth or having in your lap. It's also very personal and touched, and to bring that, but then so many of these things aren't used anymore. People are giving them away. People are selling them at a garage sale. And so I like to kind of recontextualize those household linens to bring into things that have been touched and have been integral to our daily lives that maybe are not valued anymore, to recontextualize that into a more of a fine art context. But again, then you can see these three fabrics really contrast with each other. This is a gravity ice dye on a silk crepe, and again, it's that flat fabric that really absorbs the light. And then this is a linen silk double weave, and it has this kind of texture, actually fabricated in the making of this fabric. And so when I stitch this, and these are unstitched and haven't been connected yet, obviously, I can really emphasize all of these kind of details to bring in that three-dimensional quality. So for me, it's important on these 3D forms, but they're already in three dimensions. Sometimes it's even more important on a two-dimensional work where I'm still wanting to have a sculptural quality to the work, because I do feel that I'm a sculptor. That's what I do, but sometimes I work in two dimensions. So for me, it's really important to be able to bring that sense of objectness to a two-dimensional work that relates it to the sculpture as well. These works are kind of a new, I wouldn't say experiment, but a new way of presenting the work where I'm not piecing it with multiple fabrics. But this is what would be called a whole cloth piece. So it's just one piece of fabric. This is, again, I haven't yet stitched it, so this, and it will be cropped in its final piece. But these two panels came from the same piece of fabric, and this actually was the center where the dye spread out from. So by cutting, by cropping, by manipulating these whole cloth pieces and then adding stitch, which does add a depth and a contrast with the line. That's where I add my line. These are, hopefully, will also have that feeling of objectness and a dimensionality. Yeah. Anything more? Let's see. What else can I say? While we're in the studio, while we're here by my sewing machines, I have two different machines I use. This is more of a traditional sewing machine. It's a little bit bigger, but it will basically sew things together. You can make clothes on it, you can make quilts on it, you could do all kinds of things with this sewing machine. This one is it's just for quilting. And what makes this machine different is that it is just for quilting. And when you sew, if you know anything about a sewing machine, there's the way a sewing machine works. There's two threads. There's a thread that comes from the top out of your spool of thread, and then there's a thread that comes from the bottom, which is in a bobbin. And basically, when you're stitching, those two threads are looping around each other, and that's what creates a stitch. Needle goes down, it loops, it goes to the next spot, it loops, and that's how you create a seam or a line of stitch. And the way that works traditionally is there's a mechanism under the needle that's called the feed dog. And what that does is it pushes the fabric under that needle. So as the stitch, I would make a stitch here, and then it pushes forward, it makes a stitch there, and so forth. This machine doesn't have feed dogs. So it's just, the thread is just going up and down, up and down, up and down. And the way that I make that line is, instead of the machine moving the fabric, I'm moving the fabric with my hands. So I am pushing the way that it's imagined that I'm drawing, but instead of using a pencil and moving the pencil on the paper, it's as if the pencil is in one place and I'm moving the paper underneath the pencil. And that is the way I'm drawing with the stitch. And it's all by using this machine. I can do it with this machine too, but it's easier. And it's just like a regular sewing machine in a sense, but it's turned 90 degrees. So I sit in front of it and I have this much space that I can work within, as opposed to this machine where I only have this much space. So would you like to see that? Yes. Okay, let's do some of this. Got a little sample I'm working on here. And so in these fern pieces, I tend to do a lot of outlining of the shape of the fronds. So this is a sample, and so you can see a little bit better on this darker background how I'm drawing with that by moving it back and forth. And it looks like I need to adjust my tension a little bit, and that's part of why I do all these tests, is making sure that the tension and the thread color and all of that is what how I want it to be. So each of my pieces, I have these little samples where I can make sure it's going to be what I want it to be before I work on the actual piece. So that's how this machine works. It's actually pretty fun because it has these two lasers in it. And so what I do is when I turn the power on with my foot, it basically, it only stitches when I move the fabric. So if I move it fast, it makes fast stitches. Oh, and if I move it slow, it makes it slower stitches. And that's controlled by these two lasers, seeing how fast the fabric is moving. Here, let's see if I can do one with only one of it exposed, so you can see that. That red light there is the second laser. So it actually, I used to do this all by just controlling how fast the speed of my foot was, matching it with my hands, and it's a learned skill, just like driving a car. You know, you get to know it. But I have to say that since I upgraded to this machine, having this regulator is really nice for the evenness of my stitches and just the ease of use. So that's been a good upgrade. But you know, it's an expensive tool, but it just was in the shop for 2 weeks. But you know, so it is a little bit of a diva, but when it works, it's great. So I do a lot of that. So that is part of the finishing of the pieces. I also will go through and let's look at this one here. I will go through and I will edge each panel with yarn and another color of thread. And what that does is it just makes all the disparate pieces kind of have an outline of the same color. And it kind of pulls, I think, all the different fabrics together and makes a nice edge. So you can see that that's just a zigzag stitch, which I use the other machine on. And as much as possible, I do put these together with machine. I do have to do some hand stitching along the edges to just make, and the bottom to make the final piece. And each piece is, you know, signed and dated in thread. So, and they have little weights. I make little weights in them so they don't tip over. And that's kind of how I make the work. I can show you a few more little tricks if you want to see them. Okay. Because the fabrics are hand dyed, I don't want to cut them until I know exactly what part of the fabric I'm going to use for the panel. So these are what the outlines of the cutouts. I'm giving away all my secrets today. And I use those to then kind of decide exactly which part of the fabric I want to use for the piece. And that it's a really helpful use, really helpful. And this is something I learned from when I was a graphic designer, is that, you know, way of cropping and looking at pieces. I build all my little pieces. These are fun. I'll show you one of these, or wherever they are. Oh, here's the one for this one. So when I have that with the outlines up on my wall here, I'll actually take photos, and I build these little tiny maquettes. So I just print them out on my color printer, and then I'm able to cut them out and just kind of tape them together so that I can kind of see them in 3 dimensions in small size before I cut, before I construct. And I'll make, you know, 6 of these, or with different fabrics, or just, it's a way of looking at things on a before I cut the fabrics. And I do the same thing when I'm working on 2D pieces, where I will basically take photographs of the textile, and then I can work in paper on a small size and kind of work out sizes and compositions and that sort of thing on a small size. So here's another one of a finished piece where, you know, it's just these little maquettes, and they're super cute. They're kind of like little paper dolls. So I really, you know, that was something I kind of discovered doing when I moved my studio home. When I had a separate studio from my house, I never had a printer at my studio. It never occurred to me how useful that would be. And I used my printer so much. It's not something I had ever thought about doing, but it really, really, and again, that's the graphic design. You know, that's going back to that training of a way. I feel like there's a lot of that in my work, although you wouldn't see it because it is so textural and so sensual, really. I mean, when you're talking about fabric, you can't, it's really, we're really talking a lot about the body, you know. We are wrapped in fabric from birth to death, you know, from our first swaddling cloths to our shroud. And it is the thing that is touching us really pretty much all the time. We are surrounded with fabric, and I think that's why the work is often so, you know, nobody goes into a gallery and tries to touch the paintings, but that happens all the time with my work. You know, people want to touch it. They want to reach out, and I do too. I go to a fiber show and I have to hold my hands behind my back because it is so compelling in that way of wanting to touch it. And I think it's because it is fabric, and our relationship with fabric is through touch most of the time. You know, you go clothes shopping and you reach out and you touch the fabric, you touch the item, like you're pre-shopping. Do I want this? How does this feel? How am I going to feel wearing this? I think there's a lot of that in the work that I do. And I think sometimes it's hard to, I think that's why sometimes it's hard to separate the art from the craft, and not that there's anything, not that they should be separated. There shouldn't be a line, but there often is a line drawn between fine art and craft. And I think that that is somewhat disappearing, really. It seems like there's a lot more acceptance of craft-based materials in fine art, and they always have been, but when something is usable, is that cup that you drink out of, you know, that you have your coffee with, it's very pleasing, it's very beautiful, it fits your hand, it's a pleasure to use, And there are artists who are working in ceramics. And so what is that line between that coffee cup and that fine art that you're displaying? And does it matter? Just questions, that you have to, when you're an artist working in a craft-based material, I think it's harder to justify that your work belongs in a gallery, that your work deserves the same prices as a painting or a stone sculpture. And that's just, things I think about. And I think probably any artist who works in fibers or ceramics or wood or any material that is also used for usable objects, you have to think about that. And yeah, so